Now, if you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing Tokyo at dawn, London at lunch, and Los Angeles at lights out, all learning the same stories. It's pretty wild when you think about it. Back to Morocco. What made the Jebel Irhoud discovery so revolutionary wasn't just the age of the fossils, it was where they were found. See, for decades, scientists had believed they knew exactly where humanity began. East Africa, the Great Rift Valley. That's where the oldest Homo sapiens fossils had been found. That's where the story started. We even had a name for it that sounded almost biblical. The Garden of Eden hypothesis. The idea was beautifully simple. Modern humans evolved in one specific place in East Africa, sometime around 200,000 years ago. Then, around 60,000 years ago, a small group of these humans walked out of Africa and eventually colonized the entire planet. Every human outside Africa, from Aboriginal Australians to Indigenous Americans to Pacific Islanders to Europeans, all of them descended from that single migration. One origin point, one exodus, one story. This became known as the Out of Africa theory, and by the 1980s and 90s, it was basically treated as fact. It was elegant. It was supported by fossil evidence and early genetic studies. It made sense of the archaeological record. It explained why genetic diversity is highest in Africa and decreases the further you get from the continent. Case closed, story over, except it wasn't. Those skulls in Jean-Jacques Hublien's hands told a different story. They were in Morocco, North Africa, over 3,000 miles from the Rift Valley, and they showed a mix of features, some startlingly modern, others more archaic. The face looked like ours, but the brain case was elongated, more primitive. These weren't quite modern humans as we know them today, but they weren't something else either. They were us, just an earlier version, us in the process of becoming, and they were everywhere across Africa, not just in one special valley. Hublin said it himself when the discovery was published in Nature. Quote, different. That's the key word. Because if humans were already spread across Africa 315,000 years ago, already showing regional variations, already adapted to different environments from Mediterranean coast to deserts to tropical forests, then the clean story falls apart. Maybe there wasn't one Garden of Eden. Maybe there were many. Maybe humanity didn't begin in a single place and spread outward in a neat wave. Maybe we emerged across an entire continent, different populations evolving, mixing, separating and mixing again over hundreds of thousands of years. Maybe the story of where we come from is messier, stranger and far more interesting than anyone imagined. And Jebel Irhoud was just the beginning, just the first crack in a foundation that scientists had thought was solid. Because once you start pulling at that thread, once you start questioning the basic narrative of human origins, everything starts to unravel in the best possible way. So what really happened? Where did we actually come from? And why are scientists now saying that almost everything we thought we knew about our origins needs to be rewritten? That's the story we're about to tell, and fair warning, it's going to take us places you never expected. To understand why scientists are now rethinking human origins, you need to understand just how completely the Out of Africa theory dominated our thinking for decades. This wasn't some minor hypothesis that scientists casually entertained. It was the foundation of everything we thought we knew about where we came from. But like most revolutionary ideas, it didn't start out that way. Go back to the late 1800s, and you'll find the scientific community in complete chaos about human origins. Everyone agreed that humans had evolved. Darwin had settled that question. But nobody could agree on where it happened. Some scientists looked at Neanderthal fossils in Europe and declared that the continent must be humanity's birthplace. Others pointed to discoveries in Asia, particularly Java Man, and insisted we evolved there. Still others championed various locations around the world. It was a mess of competing theories, national pride, and limited evidence. Then, in 1871, Charles Darwin published The Descent of Man. Among many controversial ideas, he made a prediction that most of his colleagues thought was ridiculous. Africa, he said. That's where humans evolved. His reasoning was elegant. Africa was home to our closest living relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas. If we shared a common ancestor with these apes, that ancestor probably lived where they still lived. Made sense. But Darwin didn't have evidence, just logic. And in science, logic without evidence doesn't get you very far. For the next 50 years, Darwin's prediction was mostly ignored. The action was all in Asia and Europe, where fossil hunters were making spectacular discoveries. Java man, Peking man, Heidelberg man. The early human family tree was being filled in, and Africa wasn't part of the picture. Then in 1924, everything changed. Raymond Dart, an Australian anatomist working in South Africa, received a box of fossils from a limestone quarry at Taung. Inside was a small skull, clearly some kind of ape, but with features that didn't quite fit. The teeth were wrong, too human. The brain was too large for an ape, but too small for a human. And most tellingly, the hole where the spinal cord entered the skull, the foramen magnum, was positioned underneath rather than toward the back. This creature had walked upright. Dart named it Australopithecus africanus, the southern ape from Africa. He wrote a paper claiming he'd found the missing link between apes and humans, and the scientific establishment laughed at him. Not politely disagreed, laughed. The skull was from a juvenile, they said. Just a baby ape, nothing special. The real human evolution was happening in the civilized parts of the world, Europe and Asia, not in Africa. The racism underlying these objections wasn't even subtle. Many scientists simply couldn't accept that humans, the crown of creation, had originated in what they considered a primitive continent. Dart was devastated but stubborn. He kept working, kept searching for more evidence, and slowly, grudgingly, other scientists started finding similar fossils in South Africa. By the 1940s, the scientific consensus was shifting. Maybe Dart had been onto something. Maybe Darwin was right after all. But it took the Leakey family to really blow the doors open. Louis and Mary Leakey were fossil hunting in East Africa's Rift Valley, a geological wonderland where millions of years of sediment lay exposed by tectonic activity. Other scientists had written off the region as unpromising. The Leakeys saw it differently. Starting in the 1930s and continuing through the 1970s, they made discovery after discovery. Homo habilis, one of the earliest members of our genus, found at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. Homo erectus, clearly adapted for long-distance walking, and countless stone tools showing technological development over millions of years. What made the Leakeys' work revolutionary wasn't just the fossils themselves, it was the context. They could date their discoveries using volcanic ash layers. They could show the environmental conditions our ancestors lived in. They could demonstrate technological progression over time. For the first time, human evolution wasn't just a collection of random bones. It was a story, a narrative of development that could be tracked across millions of years. And that story was happening in Africa, exactly where Darwin had predicted. By the 1970s, the African origin of early hominids was settled science. But a new question emerged. What about modern humans, Homo sapiens? Sure, our distant ancestors evolved in Africa millions of years ago, but where did our species originate? Some scientists argued for multi-regional evolution, the idea that modern humans evolved simultaneously in different parts of the world from different archaic human populations. Others championed the replacement hypothesis, that modern humans evolved in one place and then spread out. replacing all other human species they encountered. Then in 1987, a team of geneticists at Berkeley published a study that seemed to settle the question forever. They had analysed mitochondrial DNA from people around the world. Mitochondrial DNA is special. It's only inherited from your mother, never your father, which makes it perfect for tracing maternal lineages backward through time. When they constructed a family tree from all this mitochondrial DNA, something amazing emerged. Every single lineage traced back to Africa. More specifically, they all converged on a single ancestral population that lived in Africa roughly 200,000 years ago. The media immediately dubbed this common ancestor Mitochondrial Eve. The name was misleading. She wasn't the only woman alive at the time, and she wasn't the ancestor of all humans from that era, only of all humans alive today. But the name stuck, and it captured the public imagination. Here was genetic proof, hard science, showing that all modern humans shared a recent common ancestor in Africa. Combined with the fossil evidence the Leakeys and others had gathered, it created what seemed like an unshakable narrative. Out of Africa. That's where we came from. One origin point, probably in East Africa. One migration out of the continent, probably around 60,000 years ago. One story of human expansion that eventually populated the entire world. The theory was elegant, simple, and supported by multiple lines of evidence. Fossils, genetics, and archaeology all pointed to the same conclusion. By the 1990s, Out of Africa wasn't just accepted. It was taught as fact in every textbook, featured in every documentary, presented in every museum. The story had a compelling narrative arc. Humble beginnings in Africa, a dangerous journey into unknown lands, and ultimate triumph as our ancestors spread across the globe. It appealed to our love of adventure stories, our desire for clear origins, our need to understand where we came from. More importantly, it provided certainty in a field that had been plagued by competing theories and incomplete evidence for decades. Scientists could finally agree on the basic outline of human origins. This consensus was comfortable, it was tidy, and it left a little room for doubt or alternative interpretations. The few scientists who questioned the Out of Africa narrative were generally dismissed as contrarians or out of touch with the latest evidence. But there were questions the theory struggled to answer. Why did modern humans suddenly appear in the fossil record around 300,000 years ago with no clear ancestral forms? Why did early modern human fossils show up in such geographically distant locations at roughly the same time? How did a small population from East Africa manage to spread across an entire continent and beyond so rapidly? These weren't fatal flaws in the theory. They were just loose ends, details that would presumably get sorted out as more evidence emerged. Nobody expected what actually happened. Nobody predicted that new discoveries would systematically dismantle almost every major assumption of the Out of Africa theory. Because the evidence that emerged over the next 20 years didn't just fill in the gaps. It revealed that the entire story we'd been telling ourselves was far more complicated, far stranger, and far more interesting than anyone had imagined. For decades, we thought we had the story figured out. The origin of our species, where we came from, how we became human. It was elegant, simple, and profoundly satisfying. We came from one place, one small region of East Africa, one population that somehow became special, different from all the other hominins that had come before. This was the Garden of Eden model. And for a generation of scientists, it seemed like the only explanation that fit the evidence. The timeline went something like this. Around 200,000 years ago, give or take a few tens of thousands of years, something extraordinary happened in the grasslands and forests of East Africa. A new species emerged, not gradually, not through some slow evolutionary creep, but relatively quickly. Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, us. The fossils that anchored this entire narrative came from a place called Omo Kibish in southern Ethiopia. In 1967, a team led by Richard Leakey discovered two partial skulls eroding out of sediments along the Omo River. They were remarkable specimens: high, rounded craniums, reduced brow ridges, chins, all the skeletal features that distinguish modern humans from our more archaic predecessors. Initial dating suggested they were around 130,000 years old. Later, more sophisticated techniques pushed that date back to roughly 195,000 years ago, maybe even 233,000 in some estimates. But regardless of the exact number, the implication was clear. This was ground zero, the place where our species was born. Ethiopia, and more broadly East Africa, was the cradle of modern humanity. The story that emerged from these fossils was compelling. A small population, maybe just a few thousand individuals, living somewhere in East Africa, underwent a series of genetic and anatomical changes that transformed them into something new. They developed the physical features we associate with modernity: the gracile skeletons, the large globular skulls housing bigger, more complex brains, the vocal anatomy capable of producing the full range of human speech sounds. But the physical changes were just the beginning. What really mattered, according to this theory, was what was happening inside those skulls. Because somewhere around 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, something switched on. Call it behavioral modernity. Call it the Great Leap Forward. Call it whatever you want, but the idea was that humans suddenly, almost overnight in evolutionary terms, became capable of things our ancestors couldn't do. We started creating art, carving figurines, painting on cave walls, making jewelry from shells and carved bone. We developed sophisticated tools, not just the simple stone implements that hominins had been making for millions of years, but specialized implements for specific tasks. Fishing hooks, sewing needles, throwing spears with carefully balanced weights and precise aerodynamic properties. Most importantly, we developed symbolic thinking, the ability to use one thing to represent another, to create abstract categories, to think about things that weren't immediately present, past, future, the minds of other people, the nature of existence itself. This was what made us special. This was what separated us from every other species that had ever lived. And all of it supposedly originated in one place, East Africa, the Garden of Eden. The exit story was equally dramatic. For most of our species' history, according to this model, we stayed in Africa. We were an African species, perfectly adapted to African environments, but unable or unwilling to expand beyond the continent. Then around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, something changed. A small group, maybe just a few hundred individuals, crossed the narrow waters between Africa and Arabia. This wasn't random wandering. This was purposeful migration. Maybe they were following the coastline, exploiting rich marine resources as they moved. The coastal migration hypothesis suggested that these pioneering humans hugged shorelines, moving from estuary to estuary, feeding on shellfish and stranded marine mammals, gradually working their way around the Indian Ocean rim. They moved fast. Within just 10,000 or 20,000 years, their descendants had reached Southeast Asia, Australia, and even the Americas. They carried with them all the innovations that had developed in Africa, the art, the tools, the language, the symbolic thinking, and they used these advantages to outcompete every other human species they encountered. The Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, the Denisovans across the vastness of Central and Eastern Asia, the mysterious Homo floresiensis on the islands of Indonesia. All of them had been successful in their own right, surviving for hundreds of thousands of years in their respective territories. But when anatomically modern humans arrived, carrying the full package of behavioral modernity, they were overwhelmed. Within a few tens of thousands of years, all other human species were extinct. We were the only ones left, the victors in the great competition for planetary dominance, and we all traced our ancestry back to that one small population in East Africa, those few thousand individuals who had crossed some threshold and became truly human. The genetic evidence seemed to support this story perfectly. Studies of mitochondrial DNA, which passes only through the maternal line, suggested that all living humans shared a common female ancestor who lived in Africa around 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. Scientists called her mitochondrial Eve, not because she was the only woman alive at the time, but because her mitochondrial lineage was the only one that survived to the present day. Y chromosome studies, tracing the paternal line, pointed to a similar conclusion. All modern humans descended from a population that experienced a severe genetic bottleneck somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. The diversity in human DNA, compared to other great apes, was remarkably low. Chimpanzees living in a single forest in Central Africa showed more genetic variation than all 8 billion humans alive today. This suggested our entire species passed through a demographic bottleneck, a period when our population crashed to maybe 10,000 individuals or fewer. We came terrifyingly close to extinction, but somehow that small population survived, expanded, and eventually conquered the planet. The bottleneck explained everything. Why we're all so genetically similar despite living on every continent. Why there's more variation within any human population than between different populations. Why the concept of biological race makes no scientific sense when applied to humans. We simply haven't been separated long enough for meaningful genetic divergence to occur. This had profound implications that went far beyond paleontology. The single origin model became a powerful argument for human unity. We're all Africans, the story went. Every human being alive today can trace their ancestry back to that small population in East Africa. Our superficial differences in skin color, hair texture, and facial features are just recent adaptations to different climates, meaningless variations on a fundamental genetic unity. It was a beautiful story, philosophically satisfying, scientifically elegant, morally compelling, and it dominated thinking about human origins for decades. Textbooks presented it as established fact. Museums built exhibits around it. Documentary filmmakers dramatized it with CGI reconstructions of brave, cognitively modern humans, leaving Africa to populate an empty world. The narrative became so entrenched that questioning it seemed almost heretical. But here's the thing about beautiful, elegant, satisfying scientific stories. Reality doesn't care how appealing they are. And the evidence that would eventually shatter this narrative was already accumulating, hiding in plain sight at archaeological sites across Africa and beyond. The African Garden of Eden model made specific, testable predictions. If modern humans emerged in East Africa around 200,000 years ago, then older fossils with modern features shouldn't exist anywhere else. If behavioral modernity switched on around 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, then evidence of symbolic thinking, sophisticated tools, and artistic expression shouldn't appear before that time. If humans first left Africa 60,000 years ago following coastal routes, then the earliest non-African sites should show up along those routes and shouldn't predate the exit. For years, the fossil and archaeological records seemed to cooperate. New discoveries fit neatly into the established framework. When they didn't, researchers found ways to explain away the anomalies. That early site? Probably misdated. Those advanced tools? Probably made by an archaic species we don't know about yet. Those modern-looking fossils from outside the supposed cradle region? Probably not actually modern, just convergently evolved similar features. But eventually there were too many anomalies. Too many sites that didn't fit. Too many fossils in the wrong places at the wrong times. Too much evidence that the simple, elegant story was missing something crucial. Something that would force us to completely rethink what we thought we knew about where we come from and what it means to be human. The African Garden of Eden wasn't wrong exactly. Humans did originate in Africa. Our deepest genetic roots are African. But the reality turned out to be far more complex, far more interesting, and far less tidy than the single origin model suggested. Africa wasn't a garden. It was gardens, plural. Multiple populations, multiple regions, all contributing to the emergence of modern humanity. And the story of how scientists figured this out starts with a site that nobody paid much attention to at first. A cave in Morocco that would eventually rewrite everything we thought we knew. For decades, the Out of Africa story was told with confidence. Humans evolved in East Africa, somewhere around Ethiopia or Kenya, roughly 200,000 years ago. Then around 60,000 years ago, a small group walked out and colonized the world. Simple, clean, elegant. Except it wasn't true. Or at least, it wasn't the whole truth. The cracks started appearing almost immediately, but nobody wanted to see them. Not because scientists were dishonest, but because once a theory becomes dominant, once it gets taught in every textbook and referenced in every paper, questioning it becomes professionally dangerous. You risk looking like a contrarian, a troublemaker, someone who doesn't understand the consensus. So the anomalies got explained away. The contradictory evidence got filed under quote zero, and the Out of Africa narrative rolled forward like a freight train, gathering momentum with every passing year. But the fossils didn't care about consensus. They just sat there in the ground, waiting to complicate everything. Take the Florisbad skull. Found in South Africa in 1932, decades before the Out of Africa theory even existed. The skull showed a mix of archaic and modern features. Too modern for Homo erectus, too archaic for fully modern humans. It should have been a warning sign that human evolution in Africa wasn't a simple linear progression. But it got sidelined, treated as a weird outlier, a developmental dead end that didn't lead anywhere important. Then there were the North African sites, Morocco, Algeria, Libya. Places where archaeologists kept finding stone tools and fossil fragments that seemed too sophisticated, too modern for their dates. Tools that matched the kind of technology supposedly invented in East Africa, except they were showing up thousands of miles away, sometimes at dates that didn't make sense according to the standard model. The usual explanation was migration. Modern humans evolved in East Africa, then spread north, bringing their technology with them. Problem solved. Except the dates kept getting pushed back. Sites in Morocco showing sophisticated Middle Stone Age technology at 300,000 years ago. That was 100,000 years earlier than modern humans were supposed to exist. Something wasn't adding up. But here's the thing about Africa. It's not a place. It's an entire continent, the second largest landmass on Earth, spanning from the Mediterranean to the Cape of Good Hope, from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. It contains tropical rainforests, vast savannas, harsh deserts, mountain highlands, coastal zones, and everything in between. Treating Africa as a single evolutionary laboratory was like treating Europe and Asia as one homogeneous environment. It made no sense. Yet that's exactly what the Out of Africa theory did. It imagined human evolution happening in one special spot, probably somewhere in the East African Rift Valley, with all the important innovations occurring there before spreading outward. But evolution doesn't work that way. Different environments create different selection pressures. Populations adapt to local conditions. Genes flow between groups living in adjacent territories, creating gradients of genetic variation rather than sharp boundaries. If humans were evolving across the entire African continent for hundreds of thousands of years, you'd expect to see regional variations. different populations developing different traits, then occasionally mixing and sharing genes and technologies. You'd expect a messy, complicated evolutionary tree with multiple branches, not a single straight line from primitive to modern. And that's exactly what the evidence was starting to show, if anyone bothered to look. The problem was partly about where scientists chose to dig. East Africa, particularly the Rift Valley, has exceptional fossil preservation. Volcanic eruptions create layers of ash that can be precisely dated. The geology is ideal for finding and dating ancient bones, so that's where the funding went. That's where the expeditions focused. And unsurprisingly, that's where most of the famous fossils came from. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Just because we hadn't found early human fossils in other parts of Africa didn't mean they weren't there. It might just mean we hadn't looked hard enough, or that preservation conditions weren't as favourable. West Africa, for instance, has tropical conditions that destroy bones quickly. The Sahara Desert has spent millennia burying or eroding potential fossil sites. North Africa has been largely ignored by paleoanthropologists who assumed anything important would be found further south. This created a massive preservation bias. Our picture of human evolution was being shaped not by where humans actually lived, but by where their bones happened to survive and where scientists happened to look. Then the geneticists started finding something even more puzzling. Ghost populations, that's what they called them. Signals in the DNA of living Africans that suggested their ancestors had interbred with ancient populations that have left no fossil record whatsoever. The genetic signatures were clear. Modern West Africans carry DNA from an archaic human population that split from our lineage hundreds of thousands of years ago. Modern East Africans show admixture from a different ancient group. Southern Africans have genetic contributions from yet another mysterious population. These ghost populations weren't Neanderthals or Denisovans. They were African. They had been living on the continent alongside our ancestors for tens or even hundreds of thousands of years, and then they had interbred with them, leaving genetic traces that persist to this day. But where were their fossils? Where was the archaeological evidence of these other human species? The answer was probably simple. We hadn't found them yet. Or we had found them and dismissed them as strange individuals rather than recognizing them as evidence of separate populations. The Iwo Eleru skull from Nigeria is a perfect example. Found in 1965, dated to just 13,000 years ago, it showed remarkably archaic features. Heavy brow ridges, thick bone, primitive morphology. It looked like something that should have been 100,000 years older. For decades, it was treated as an anomaly, maybe a diseased individual or a genetic throwback. But what if it was evidence of a ghost population? What if archaic humans had survived in West Africa until extremely recent times, living alongside modern humans and occasionally interbreeding with them? The genetic evidence suggested exactly that. But accepting it meant accepting that human evolution in Africa had been far messier and more complex than anyone wanted to believe. There was also the uncomfortable fact that some researchers had been saying this all along. The multi-regional evolution hypothesis, proposed back in the 1980s, suggested that modern humans evolved simultaneously across multiple regions, with gene flow between populations maintaining our species unity while allowing for regional variations. The hypothesis was viciously attacked by out-of-Africa proponents. It was associated with outdated ideas about racial differences. It seemed to contradict the genetic evidence for an African origin. And frankly, it was complicated. The out-of-Africa model was simpler, cleaner, easier to teach and understand. So multi-regional evolution got sidelined, dismissed as fringe thinking. Its supporters found it harder to get funding, harder to publish in prestigious journals. The scientific community had made its choice, and anyone who disagreed was swimming against the tide. But here's what nobody wanted to admit. The multi-regional people had been right about some things. They had recognized that human evolution couldn't be reduced to a simple out-of-Africa migration. They had understood that populations in different regions could develop distinct traits while still maintaining enough genetic contact to remain a single species. They had just been wrong about the geography. They thought the multiple regions were different continents. Turns out the multiple regions were all in Africa. The scientific culture around human origins research had become tribal. You were either team out of Africa or you were wrong. Questioning the consensus, even with good evidence, meant risking your reputation. Young researchers learned quickly not to push too hard against the dominant theory. Funding agencies preferred safe projects that would confirm what everyone already believed. This created a kind of intellectual inertia. The theory became self-reinforcing. Evidence that supported it got published prominently. Evidence that contradicted it got buried in obscure journals or explained away with ad hoc hypotheses. And anyone who pointed out the contradictions got labelled a troublemaker. But science has a way of correcting itself eventually. The fossils keep coming out of the ground. The genetic evidence keeps accumulating. And sooner or later the weight of contradictory evidence becomes too heavy to ignore. By the early 2000s, that moment was approaching. The cracks in the foundation were becoming chasms. The anomalies were piling up faster than they could be explained away. And a few brave researchers were starting to say publicly what many had been thinking privately. The out-of-Africa theory, as originally conceived, was incomplete at best and fundamentally wrong at worst. Human evolution in Africa had been far more complex than anyone had imagined. Multiple populations, multiple regions, multiple evolutionary experiments all happening simultaneously across the continent. But it would take a spectacular discovery to finally break the consensus, a find so significant that it couldn't be dismissed or explained away, a fossil that would force the entire field to reconsider everything they thought they knew. And that discovery was about to emerge from a cave in Morocco, of all places, far from the supposed cradle of humanity in East Africa, in a location where modern humans weren't supposed to have existed at the dates the fossils would show. Everything was about to change. Now here's where things get really interesting, because everything we just talked about, all those careful reconstructions of human evolution, all those theories about African origins, they were built on a foundation that was about to crack wide open. The year was 1961. Not in some prestigious research facility, not during a planned archaeological expedition, but in a Brit mine in Morocco. Workers were digging into a hillside called Jebel Irhoud, just looking to extract minerals for industrial use, when they hit something that wasn't supposed to be there. A human skull, embedded in rock, old rock. The mining company did what they were supposed to do. They called in scientists. French and Moroccan researchers arrived and began carefully excavating the site. What they found was remarkable. Not just one skull, but multiple individuals, adults and children, along with stone tools, lots of stone tools. But here's the problem. The skulls were weird. They had faces that looked reasonably modern, high cheekbones, relatively flat profiles, but their brain cases were long and low, more archaic looking, like something intermediate between earlier human species and modern humans. So the scientists did what made sense at the time. They classified the fossils as Neanderthals, or maybe some kind of African Neanderthal cousin. The dating techniques available in the 1960s suggested they were maybe 40,000 years old. Interesting, sure, but not revolutionary. Just another data point showing human evolution was messy and complex. And then the fossils essentially disappeared from the main narrative of human origins. They sat in museums. They got mentioned occasionally in academic papers. But they didn't fit neatly into the emerging out-of-Africa story, so they got sidelined, treated as curiosities rather than crucial evidence. Decades passed. The out-of-Africa theory became dominant. The search for human origins focused on East Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania. That's where the important fossils were supposed to be. That's where humanity began. But some researchers couldn't stop thinking about those strange Moroccan skulls. Enter Jean-Jacques Hublin, a paleoanthropologist who had spent decades studying human evolution. Hublin looked at those Jebel Irhoud fossils and saw something everyone else had missed. Those faces. They weren't Neanderthal. They were too modern, too much like us. What if, he thought, what if they're not 40,000 years old? What if the dating was wrong? So in the early 2000s, Hublin assembled a team and went back to Jebel Irhoud. Not to the old mining site which had been destroyed, but to nearby areas that might still contain fossils. They spent years carefully excavating, sieving through sediment, looking for anything that might have been missed, and they found it. More skull fragments, more bones, more tools, but more importantly, they found material that could be dated using modern techniques. The dating methods available in the 1960s had been crude, mostly guesswork based on geological layers and associated animal fossils. But by the 2010s, scientists had something much better: thermoluminescence dating. This technique measures when minerals were last exposed to heat or sunlight, perfect for stone tools that had been heated by ancient fires. Hublin's team collected flint tools from the archaeological layers. They sent them to specialized laboratories, and then they waited. When the results came back in 2017, nobody was prepared for what they showed. The Jebel Irhoud fossils weren't 40,000 years old. They were 300,000 years old. Maybe older. 300,000 years. Let that sink in for a moment. The oldest previously accepted Homo sapiens fossils from Ethiopia were dated to about 195,000 years ago. These Moroccan fossils push the origin of our species back by more than 100,000 years, but it gets better. Because Jebel Irhoud isn't in East Africa, it's in Northwest Africa, Morocco. About as far from the supposed cradle of humanity as you can get while staying on the continent. The scientific paper announcing the discovery landed like a bomb in 2017. Published in Nature, one of the most prestigious journals in the world. The title was careful, academic, but the implications were revolutionary. Picture what these people looked like. You've got faces that would blend in reasonably well in a modern crowd. If you dressed one of them in contemporary clothes and had them walk down a street, you'd notice something was off, but you might not immediately clock them as a different species. The face shape was right. The proportions mostly modern, but turn them around. The back of the skull tells a different story. Long, low, stretched out. The brain case hasn't fully globularized yet. It's still got that archaic shape. Brain size was similar to ours, but the brain was organized differently. Less expanded in the frontal regions, associated with complex planning and abstract thought. So what were they? Hublin's team called them early Homo sapiens, the oldest members of our species yet discovered. But they weren't quite us. They were us in progress, us becoming, and the tools. Oh, the tools. This is where it gets really fascinating. The stone tools found at Jebel Irhoud were made using something called the Levallois technique. This is sophisticated stuff. You don't just bash rocks together and hope for the best. You carefully prepare a stone core, shaping it so that when you strike it in just the right place, it produces a thin, sharp flake with a predetermined shape. This requires planning. Abstract visualization. The ability to see the tool hidden inside the rock before you start working. It requires teaching and learning, because nobody figures this out by accident. The Levallois technique was supposed to be an East African innovation, associated with the later stages of human evolution. But here it was, in Morocco, 300,000 years ago, being used by people whose skulls were only partially modern. The immediate reaction from the scientific community was complicated. Excitement mixed with skepticism, mixed with territorial academic anxiety. Because if Hublin was right, if these really were early Homo sapiens, then everything needed to be reconsidered. Some researchers immediately embraced the findings. Finally, they said. Finally, someone's paying attention to the rest of Africa. The East African bias in human origins research had always bothered them. This was vindication. Others pushed back. Maybe these weren't Homo sapiens at all. Maybe they were some other species that just happened to look similar. Or maybe they were Homo sapiens, but they were an evolutionary dead end. A failed experiment that went extinct while the real action was happening in East Africa. But the evidence kept piling up. Other sites in Morocco yielded similar fossils, similar tools, all from roughly the same time period. This wasn't a fluke. This was a population. A successful, widespread population of early humans living across northwest Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago. And they weren't isolated. The stone tool traditions at Jebel Irhoud show connections to sites thousands of miles away. Similar techniques showing up in East Africa, West Africa, even the Middle East. These people were connected, part of networks that stretched across the continent. This is when the Pan-African origin hypothesis started taking shape. Not humans evolving in one small area and then spreading out, but humans evolving across all of Africa simultaneously. Multiple populations in different regions, connected by migration and gene flow, all contributing to what would eventually become Homo sapiens. Jebel Irhoud showed us that 300,000 years ago, people with nearly modern faces and sophisticated tool technologies were living in northwest Africa. Other sites were showing similar dates for fossils in East Africa, South Africa, West Africa. Different populations, slightly different skull shapes, but all trending in the same direction, all becoming more modern over time. It's like evolution was conducting the same experiment in multiple locations simultaneously. Each population adapting to local conditions while remaining connected enough to share innovations and genes. Some populations developing certain modern traits faster than others. But all of them moving toward the same endpoint. The Moroccan Revolution, as some researchers started calling it, wasn't just about one site or one set of fossils. It was about recognizing that Africa isn't a small place. It's enormous, diverse, full of different environments and ecological opportunities. Why would humans evolve in just one tiny corner of such a vast continent? Why wouldn't evolution take advantage of all that space, all those different selection pressures? The simple story, the Garden of Eden story, was falling apart. Not because it was entirely wrong, but because it was incomplete, dangerously simplified, a narrative that fit our desire for tidy origins but didn't match the messy reality of how evolution actually works. Hublin and his team had cracked open a door, and behind that door was a much bigger, much more complex story. A story that was still being written in the rocks and sediments of Africa. A story that would force us to completely reimagine what we thought we knew about where we came from. But Jebel Irhoud was just the beginning. Because once researchers started looking beyond East Africa, really looking, they started finding evidence everywhere. Evidence that the story of human origins was bigger than anyone had imagined. For decades, we imagined a garden, one perfect place in Africa where the first modern humans evolved. A single population becoming smarter, more sophisticated, more human, then spreading out to conquer the world. It was a beautiful story, simple, elegant, and completely wrong. Africa isn't a garden, it's a continent, the second largest on Earth. 11.7 million square miles of deserts, rainforests, savannas, mountains, and coastlines. Thousands of distinct ecosystems separated by massive geographical barriers. Rivers wider than most countries. Deserts that stretch for 1,000 miles. Mountain ranges that pierce the clouds. rainforests so dense that populations living 50 miles apart might as well be living on different planets. And we thought modern humans evolved in just one spot. That's not how evolution works. That's not how anything works. The evidence has been staring us in the face for decades. We just didn't want to see it. Or maybe we couldn't see it because we were looking for the wrong thing. We were searching for the cradle of humanity, singular, when we should have been looking for cradles, plural. A network of populations scattered across the continent, evolving together but separately, connected by threads of gene flow, but isolated enough to develop their own unique characteristics. This is what scientists now call African multi-regionalism. It's a mouthful, but the concept is actually pretty straightforward. Instead of one ancestral population giving rise to all modern humans, we're looking at multiple distinct groups spread across Africa, exchanging genes whenever their ranges overlapped, but spending most of their time evolving independently in response to local conditions. Think about what Africa looked like between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago, the period when modern humans were supposedly emerging. The continent was experiencing wild climate fluctuations. Every 20,000 years or so, the entire geography would transform. During wet periods, the Sahara wasn't a desert at all. It was green. Rivers flowed through what is now endless sand. Lakes appeared where today there's nothing but rock and dust. Animals migrated north from sub-Saharan Africa, and humans followed them. Then the climate would shift. Within just a few thousand years, those green corridors would vanish. Populations that had been connected would suddenly find themselves separated by expanding deserts. The Sahara would become an impenetrable barrier, cutting off North Africa from the populations further south. And those separated groups would begin evolving in different directions. This pattern repeated over and over. Green Sahara, genetic exchange, population mixing, then drought, separation, independent evolution, then green Sahara again, reconnection, more mixing. For hundreds of thousands of years, African human populations were playing this elaborate game of connection and isolation, coming together, drifting apart, coming together again. And every time they reconnected, they brought new genes, new technologies, new ideas. The groups that had spent millennia adapting to the forests of Central Africa would meet groups that had evolved in the grasslands of East Africa. Populations from the Mediterranean coast would encounter people from the Cape. They would exchange genes, share knowledge, and create children who carried adaptations from multiple environments. The archaeological evidence for this is stunning once you know what to look for. Take Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, where those 300,000-year-old fossils turn the field upside down. The people buried there had a strange mix of features. Modern-looking faces, but archaic skull shapes. This wasn't what you'd expect from a single population evolving steadily toward modernity. This was what you'd expect from a population that was part of a larger network, exchanging genes with groups that had different evolutionary trajectories. Then there's Florisbad in South Africa, nearly 2,000 miles to the south. Fossils there date to around 260,000 years ago, and they show a different mix of features, more archaic in some ways, more modern in others. Not because the people at Florisbad were at a different stage of evolution than the people at Jebel Irhoud, but because they were part of different regional populations within the same continental network. Move east to Ethiopia, and you find the Herto skulls, dating to about 160,000 years ago. These look distinctly more modern than either Jebel Irhoud or Florisbad. Larger brain cases, more gracile bone structure, features that would fit comfortably on any modern human. But were they the first modern humans, or just one population within a larger network that happened to have evolved more modern-looking features earlier than other groups? Tanzania gives us even more complexity. Sites like Latoli show human occupation stretching back millions of years. But during the critical period between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago, we see something interesting. Stone tool technologies that appear suddenly, persist for a while, then disappear, only to reappear thousands of years later. This is the signature of populations moving in and out of the region. Waves of migration bringing new technologies, then local populations either adopting them or disappearing, being replaced by new groups with different cultural traditions. The picture that emerges is breathtakingly complex. Africa wasn't one population evolving in one place. It was dozens, maybe hundreds of distinct populations, scattered across different environments, connected by corridors that opened and closed with the climate cycles. Rivers were critical to this network. The Nile, flowing north through the entire continent, connected Mediterranean Africa to the tropical interior. During wet periods, when the river flowed strong and its tributaries expanded, populations could move along these watery highways, carrying genes and technologies thousands of miles. The Congo River system did the same thing in Central Africa, creating connections between the Atlantic coast and the interior forests, the Zambezi in the south, the Niger in the west. These weren't just sources of water, they were communication networks, genetic highways that kept isolated populations connected. Lakes played a similar role. East Africa's Great Rift Valley contains some of the largest, deepest lakes on Earth. During wet periods, these lakes expanded dramatically, creating huge productive ecosystems that could support large human populations. When the climate dried, the lakes shrank, forcing populations to either adapt or migrate elsewhere. This cycle of expansion and contraction created exactly the conditions for rapid evolution. Isolated populations adapting to local conditions, then reconnecting and exchanging their accumulated adaptations with other groups. Coastlines were perhaps most important of all. Africa has over 18,000 miles of coastline, and coastal resources are uniquely stable compared to inland environments. When droughts devastated the interior, coastal populations could survive on shellfish, fish, and marine mammals. Archaeological sites along both the Atlantic and Indian Ocean coasts show continuous human occupation through periods when the interior was largely empty. These coastal populations became refuges, genetic reservoirs that preserved diversity when climate disasters struck inland regions. The genetic evidence supports all of this beautifully, though it took decades for scientists to understand what they were seeing. Early genetic studies showed that modern humans have unusually deep population structure within Africa. What this means is that different African populations are genetically more different from each other than they should be if we all descended from a single recent ancestor. Some African groups separated from each other over 200,000 years ago, maybe longer. That's not what you'd expect if modern humans emerged from one small population 150,000 years ago. But it makes perfect sense if modern humanity emerged from a network of populations that were already partially separated. The San people of southern Africa, the Mbuti of the Congo rainforest, the Ethiopian highlanders, these groups show genetic signatures of ancient isolation. They weren't isolated completely. There's clear evidence of gene flow, occasional mixing that kept them all part of the same species, but they spent long periods evolving independently, accumulating their own unique genetic variants. This is why some geneticists now talk about structured populations and metapopulation dynamics when discussing human origins. We weren't one population. We were a network. Individual nodes in the network would grow, shrink, sometimes go extinct. But the network as a whole survived, and more importantly, evolved. When populations reconnected after periods of isolation, they brought together different evolutionary experiments, different solutions to the problem of being human in Africa's wildly diverse environments. Maybe one population had evolved better resistance to tropical diseases. Another had developed more efficient thermoregulation for hot, dry climates. A third had larger brains or better language capabilities. When these populations mixed, their children inherited advantageous traits from multiple lineages. This is called admixture, and it's incredibly powerful evolutionarily. It creates variation much faster than mutation alone, giving natural selection more raw material to work with. The isolation and reconnection cycle may have been the engine of our evolution. Not steady change in one direction, but punctuated bursts of innovation as populations came together, mixed, and created new combinations of traits. Think of it like this. Evolution through isolation gives you specialized adaptations. Evolution through mixing gives you versatility. The populations that became modern humans got both. Specialized enough to thrive in specific environments, versatile enough to adapt when conditions changed. This explains something that has puzzled anthropologists for years. Why did behaviorally modern traits appear sporadically across Africa before becoming universal? Archaeological sites show sophisticated stone tools appearing 300,000 years ago in some places, but not becoming widespread until much later. Symbolic art shows up 100,000 years ago in South Africa, then vanishes, then reappears elsewhere. Systematic use of fire, complex hunting strategies, even burial practices all appear and disappear across different times and places. We used to think these were false starts, populations that almost became modern but didn't quite make it. Now we understand they were part of the network. Individual populations developing modern behaviors in isolation, then either dying out or mixing their innovations into the broader gene pool when reconnection happened. The traits that spread were the ones that worked in multiple environments, the ones that got selected for again and again in different contexts. Humanity didn't emerge from one place. It emerged from many places, many populations, all evolving together across an entire continent. We are the product not of one successful experiment, but of hundreds of experiments running simultaneously, their results mixing and remixing over hundreds of thousands of years. Every modern human carries genetic heritage from multiple ancient African populations. We are all mixtures, all products of that vast continental network that kept trying different solutions until it found combinations that worked everywhere. The beautiful complexity of it takes your breath away once you see it clearly. Not one garden, but a whole continent of gardens, connected by rivers and trade routes and marriage exchanges and slow patient gene flow. This is how we became human. Not in one place, but everywhere. Not in one moment, but across hundreds of thousands of years. Africa didn't give birth to modern humans. Africa was the womb, vast and complex, where we grew slowly from many seeds into something that could eventually walk out and inherit the earth. So, back to that small group stepping out of Africa 60,000 years ago. For a long time, that was the clean line in the story. Before 60,000 years ago, humans are in Africa. After 60,000 years ago, they leave Africa and spread across the world. Simple, elegant, easy to put in a textbook diagram with arrows starting at one point and radiating outward. But nature doesn't like clean lines, and human evolution especially doesn't. As scientists started to dig deeper into the rocks and the DNA, the neat picture began to blur. Evidence started showing up that looked wrong. Humans outside Africa long before the supposed big exit. Fossils that didn't fit the timeline. Bones that looked like ours, in places and at times where they just weren't supposed to be. The first big crack in that 60,000-year wall came from a cave on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean. Mislia Cave on the slopes of Mount Carmel in Israel. Inside that cave, archaeologists found a partial upper jaw, just a fragment with some teeth still rooted in place. At first glance, it didn't look like much, but when specialists examined it, they realized this wasn't Neanderthal. It wasn't some earlier hominin. It was us, anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Oh, And when they dated it, the numbers came back like a thunderclap. About 180,000 years old. That's more than 100,000 years before the main out-of-Africa migration. For decades, the story had been that modern humans only successfully expanded out of Africa around 60 or maybe 70,000 years ago. But this jaw said something else. Humans like us were already in the Levant, living in caves above the Mediterranean 180,000 years ago. They were hunting, making tools, building fires, leaving ash and stone and bone layers behind. They saw the same stars that would guide sailors and caravans millennia later, and then they disappeared. Their genes, as far as we can tell, don't make a major contribution to modern non-African populations. This suggests something important. The world outside Africa wasn't just discovered once. It was visited, explored, colonized, lost, and rediscovered. Over and over. Mislia isn't a strange exception. It's one clue in a growing pattern. Travel west in your mind, across the Mediterranean, to the rugged coasts of southern Greece. There, in a place called Apodema Cave, a team of researchers working with some old museum fossils made another unsettling discovery. Decades earlier, fragmentary skulls had been collected from the cave and then largely forgotten, stored away in drawers. When modern dating techniques were finally used on them, one of those pieces, called Apodema 1, gave an astonishing result. Roughly 210,000 years old, and its shape, more rounded at the back, more like a modern human skull than a Neanderthal one. Not a perfect match, not a full skull, but enough that some researchers argued this might be an early Homo sapiens in Europe, over 200,000 years ago. If that interpretation is right, and not everyone agrees, it means humans like us briefly reached southern Europe long before the Neanderthals' supposed monopoly. They came, they lived there, and then they vanished, leaving the continent once again to our cold-adapted cousins. Mislia in the Levant, Apodema in Greece. Together they whisper the same thing. Out of Africa wasn't a single heroic march. It was a stuttering, complicated process. A pulse, then another. Advances and retreats. Migrations that flourished for a while and then ended in silence. Some of those journeys left little or no genetic trace in modern people. Evolutionary dead ends. But they happened. They are part of our story. And then, as you drift further east in your imagination, past the deserts, across the mountains of Central Asia, there's another player waiting in the dark. A cousin we never knew we had, whose face we still don't truly know. The Denisovans. Their entire known fossil record as of now could fit in the palm of your hand. A few teeth, a pinky bone from a little finger, a jawbone from a high-altitude cave on the Tibetan plateau. That's it. No complete skull, no full skeleton, no dramatic Lucy-style discovery to put on a museum poster. If you walked past a Denisovan in the street, we don't actually know what you would see. But their DNA, that's everywhere from Siberia to the Pacific. Their ghost is in our genomes. It started in a cave in southern Siberia. Denisova Cave. Archaeologists had been excavating there for years. They knew Neanderthals had lived in it. They knew modern humans had visited. It's a kind of crossroads cave, a place where multiple human species pass through over thousands of years. Then geneticists sequenced the DNA from that little finger bone. They expected Neanderthal, or perhaps modern human. What they found was neither. The genome was human, but different. Closely related to Neanderthals, yes, but distinct enough to be its own lineage. Another branch of the post-bottleneck radiation, a sister species. Not quite us, not quite Neanderthal, something else. The Denisovans had been there all along, invisible, hiding in plain sight until genetics turned on the lights. When researchers started looking for Denisovan DNA in living people, they found it in a very particular pattern. high levels in populations from Melanesia, New Guinea, parts of the Philippines, and some indigenous Australian groups. Lower but still detectable levels in parts of East and Southeast Asia. That distribution tells a story. It suggests that Denisovans weren't just sitting in one Siberian cave. They were spread across vast stretches of Asia, adapting to different climates, interbreeding with incoming modern humans more than once, in more than one place. In Tibet, their legacy is written in the blood. A gene variant called EPA-YES. One helps people cope with low oxygen at high altitudes. It allows modern Tibetans to live, work and raise children on the roof of the world without the dangerous side effects that lowlanders often experience. Genetic sleuthing shows that this variant doesn't come from ancient Africans. It doesn't come from Neanderthals either. It comes from Denisovans. Thousands of years ago, modern humans moving into the high plateau interbred with Denisovan-related populations already adapted to the thin air. Their children inherited Denisovan survival genes, and those genes are still at work today, quietly, every time a Tibetan walks through the streets of Lhasa or climbs a high pass without gasping for breath. Neanderthals left similar traces, just in different parts of our biology. Genes that tune our immune system, genes that affect skin and hair, genes that may influence how we respond to certain diseases or even how we sleep. This isn't a story of simple replacement. It's a story of absorption, entanglement, and blending. For years, the narrative was, modern humans leave Africa, meet Neanderthals, and replace them. End of chapter. But the DNA tells a more intimate tale. When modern humans spread into the Middle East and Europe around 60,000 years ago, they didn't just compete with Neanderthals. They lived alongside them, learned from them, borrowed tool ideas, possibly shared hunting grounds, and at least sometimes had children together. We still don't know exactly what those meetings were like. Were they mostly peaceful? Small groups cautiously trading and occasionally forming mixed families? Were there also conflicts, violent encounters over territory and game? Almost certainly. Human history has always contained both cooperation and competition. What we do know is that interbreeding happened multiple times. Genetic studies show that people whose ancestors lived outside Africa carry about 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. Some populations in Asia and Oceania also carry Denisovan DNA, adding another layer. There are hints that Neanderthals and Denisovans interbred with each other as well. A bone fragment from Denisova Cave belonged to a young girl whose mother was Neanderthal and whose father was Denisovan. She was literally a hybrid child of two different human species. If you imagine all these interactions over tens of thousands of years, you start to see why the old clean model breaks down. Humanity's expansion out of Africa wasn't a simple replacement wave washing over everything in its path. It was more like a series of tides, each one rising, falling, mixing with what came before. Some waves left deep marks in the sand of our DNA. Others surged, then receded, leaving almost nothing behind but a fossil in a cave wall and a mystery for future scientists. And while all this was unfolding, Asia itself was already a crowded stage. Long before modern humans arrived, Asia was home to other human species. Homo erectus had been there for more than 1 million years, sturdy, long-legged travellers who first carried the human lineage out of Africa into places like Java and China. In some regions, they held on surprisingly late, perhaps until around 100,000 years ago. Then there's Homo floresiensis, the hobbit of the Indonesian island of Flores. 3 foot tall with tiny brains but surprisingly sophisticated tools. They hunted dwarf elephants and giant storks on an island that seems like it had its own little evolutionary fairy tale. They may have survived until as recently as 50,000 years ago, right around the time modern humans were sweeping through Southeast Asia. Elsewhere in the region, in the Philippines, another small-bodied hominin was discovered, Homo luzernensis. With its own strange mixture of ancient and modern features, it adds yet another layer of complexity to the map. So as modern humans moved eastward from Africa, they weren't entering an empty world. They were stepping into a continent already populated by multiple kinds of humans, Erectus-like holdouts, Denisovans, little island specialists like the hobbits, and Luzernensis, and, further west, the Neanderthals holding their icy fortresses in Europe and Western Asia. The old picture showed one line leaving Africa, one big arrow spreading across a blank map. The new picture looks more like a tangled web. Multiple exits from Africa at different times, some early, like Mislia and perhaps Apidema, pushing into the Levant and southern Europe, then failing when climates shifted or competitors pushed back. Later waves, around 120,000 years ago, leaving traces in Arabian stone tools. The final big wave around 60,000 years ago, the one that did stick, mixing with Neanderthals and Denisovans, skirting past hobbits and other island oddities, and eventually circling the globe. Out of Africa didn't happen once. It happened again and again. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Each attempt left fragments. A jaw here, a tooth there, a segment of DNA preserved in the cells of people who would never know they carried ghosts from Siberian caves or high Tibetan valleys. As you lie there listening, you can think of our species as a traveller who kept approaching the door to the wider world. A few times we opened it, stepped out, walked a little way, then turned back or were forced to retreat. Other times we stepped through and stayed, weaving ourselves into the lives of the people already there. Neanderthals with their heavy bones and big brains, Denisovans on their mountain plateaus, island dwarfs on forested volcanoes. Only one of those human lineages is still here in full form, but the others are not gone. They live on as whispers in our genomes, as tools buried in caves, as skull fragments in museum drawers that still have more to say. The journey out of Africa wasn't a single road. It was a network of paths, some crossed, some lost, some still only dimly seen. And to understand how we finally became the only humans left standing, we have to turn to the other great archive of our past. Not just bones and stones, but molecules, our DNA. The next part of the story is written not in caves or deserts, but in the spiraled code inside every one of your cells. Now imagine the camera slowly pulling away from bones in the ground and turning inward, into you. Because the next chapter of this story isn't written in rock or buried tools. It's written in your blood, in the cells quietly repairing themselves while you sleep, in the spiraled ladders of DNA coiled inside every one of your trillions of cells. For most of the 20th century, scientists trying to understand human origins were basically blind to this inner archive. They had fossils, stone tools, a few scattered clues in the earth, but the genetic story, the record of who met whom, who had children with whom, who survived and who didn't, that was all locked away in fragile molecules that decayed almost as soon as an organism died. Then, in the last 2 decades, something extraordinary happened. We learned how to read time. In ultra-clean labs behind layers of glass and filtered air, researchers began coaxing tiny scraps of DNA out of ancient bones and teeth, not just from fossils thousands of years old, but from remains tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years old. They sequenced these fragments, stitched them together, and compared them to the genomes of living people. What they found didn't just tweak the out of Africa story, it detonated it. You can think of ancient DNA like a time machine that doesn't take your body anywhere, but lets your mind drift backward into the lives of people who have been dust for 40,000 years. Their genetic code is still whispering from inside your own, and those whispers tell a very different story from the nice clean diagrams in old textbooks. For a long time, the standard picture went like this. modern humans evolved in Africa, left in a big wave around 60,000 years ago, spread across the world and replaced everyone else. Neanderthals, Denisovans, any other archaic humans they met. They vanished, and we took over. No mixing, no entanglement, just replacement. Ancient DNA told us that was wrong in the most personal way possible. If you're of recent European, Asian or indigenous American ancestry, there's a very high chance that somewhere inside your genome, right now, are stretches of Neanderthal DNA. Pieces of chromosomes that once lived inside the bodies of Neanderthals crouched around Ice Age fires, now quietly influencing your skin, your immune system, maybe even how you sleep. On average, non-African populations today carry about 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. That doesn't sound like much, until you realize that it's not the same 1 to 2% in every person. Different people carry different Neanderthal segments. If you add up all the Neanderthal fragments scattered across all living non-African genomes, you recover well over a third of the entire Neanderthal genome. Some estimates push that number closer to half. In other words, Neanderthals are gone as a separate species, but genetically, they're not gone at all. They've been dissolved into us. The traits they gave us were not random. Many of the surviving Neanderthal genes seem to be involved in immunity, skin, and hair, things that matter when you step into new climates full of unfamiliar pathogens and unfamiliar sunlight. When our ancestors left Africa and walked into Eurasia, they met Neanderthals who had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. Neanderthals had already paid the evolutionary price for surviving in those environments. Their genes carried the receipts. So when modern humans and Neanderthals interbred, those genes were like a starter kit for survival in the north. Better resistance to local diseases, different pigmentation tuned to colder, dimmer or more seasonal sunlight, maybe inflammatory responses that helped fight off infections, even if they sometimes made us more prone to allergies and autoimmune issues today. And Neanderthals weren't the only ones whose legacy we carry. Far to the east, another group was leaving its mark, the Denisovans. For years, Denisovans were a ghost species. No skull you could point to in a museum, no dramatic reconstructions on posters, just a few broken bones and teeth from a cave in Siberia, and their DNA. When scientists sequenced that DNA, then compared it with people alive today, they found something astonishing. In parts of Melanesia, places like Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and surrounding regions, people carry up to 4, 5, even 6% Denisovan ancestry. Some indigenous Australian populations and certain groups in Southeast Asia also show strong Denisovan signals. That's 2 or 3 times the average Neanderthal contribution in most Europeans or East Asians. It's as if Denisovans vanished from the fossil record but stayed very much alive in the genetic record. And once again, the genes that survived weren't random. Some Denisovan variants help modern Tibetans live on the rooftop of the world, high on the Himalayan plateau, where oxygen is scarce and altitude sickness threatens anyone not biologically prepared. A key gene called EPAS1, which helps regulate the body's response to low oxygen, seems to have arrived in our lineage from Denisovans. When you watch a Tibetan grandmother walking up a steep mountain path without losing her breath, you're seeing ancient Denisovan DNA in action. Other Denisovan genes appear to be tied to immune function and diet, helping people adapt to new landscapes, new parasites, and new plants. So we have Neanderthals contributing here, Denisovans contributing there. A quiet tapestry of ancient encounters written into our chromosomes. But the real shock came when scientists looked more closely at Africa. For years, the story went like this. People in Africa are purely modern human, while people outside Africa carry a bit of Neanderthal or Denisovan ancestry from ancient interbreeding. Africa was seen as the untouched source, the original stream before it split and mixed. Genetics painted a more complex picture. When researchers examined African genomes in detail, they started noticing odd patterns, chunks of DNA that didn't match typical modern human variation and also didn't line up with known Neanderthal or Denisovan sequences. These segments seem to be much older, diverging from the main human line perhaps 500,000, 700,000, even 1 million years ago. Yet they were still present in living Africans today. The best explanation many geneticists have come up with is that within Africa, modern humans, or their immediate ancestors, interbred with other, now extinct human lineages that we've never identified in the fossil record. Unknown cousins, sometimes called ghost populations, who left no recognized skeletons that we can confidently name, but who left children, and those children are our ancestors. Some studies suggest that certain West African populations might carry up to 2 to 19% ancestry from one or more of these unknown archaic groups. Not all geneticists agree on the details, and the exact numbers are still debated. But the pattern keeps reappearing. Traces of deeply divergent lineages woven into modern African genomes. This means that Africa was never a simple single cradle. It was more like a crowded landscape of related but distinct human groups, some closer to us, some further removed, occasionally mixing, sometimes replacing, sometimes absorbing each other. The genetic time machine was forcing scientists to abandon the comforting idea of a straight line from primitive to modern, and even the simple branching tree of separate species evolving in neat isolation. Instead, they were seeing something messier, something more tangled, more alive. But to understand how tangled, we need to talk about two figures who once seemed like the ultimate anchors in our story. Mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. In the late 1980s, scientists analysed mitochondrial DNA, a special kind of DNA passed almost exclusively from mothers to children, and found that all modern human mitochondrial lineages trace back to a woman who lived in Africa, probably between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago. They nicknamed her Mitochondrial Eve. Later, studies of the Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed down from fathers to sons, revealed a similar pattern on the male side. All living Y chromosomes are descendants of a man who likely lived in Africa, maybe around 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, though estimates vary and have been revised with new data. He became known as Y chromosome Adam. The public imagination seized on these names. It sounded biblical, almost mystical. One mother of us all, one father of us all, point sources for the entire human family. But the reality is more subtle and more interesting. Mitochondrial Eve was not the only woman alive in her time. She was not the first human woman, or the only one who left descendants. She's simply the most recent woman whose mitochondrial lineage survived in everyone alive today. Other women of her era had children. Some of their daughters' lines died out. Some ended in sons who could not pass on mitochondrial DNA. Over tens of thousands of years, lineages narrowed, branched, and disappeared, leaving hers as the last unbroken thread on the maternal side. The same is true for Y chromosome Adam. He was not the first man, not the only man, not even necessarily the most important man of his generation. He's just the most recent individual from whom every living man inherited his Y chromosome. Even more intriguing, mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam did not live at the same time. Their lives were separated, perhaps by tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years. They were not a couple. They never met. They belonged to different chapters of our story. If you picture our ancestry as rooted in a single man and a single woman standing in the savannah together, you miss the real drama. Countless men and women, countless lineages, intertwining, crossing, ending, and re-emerging, with only a few particular threads surviving on each specialized piece of DNA. And those specialized pieces don't tell the whole story of our ancestry. Mitochondrial Eve represents just one tiny ring of DNA in each cell. Bichromosome Adam represents just one chromosome out of 23. The rest of your genome, your autosomes, carry far richer, more complicated histories. On those chromosomes, different segments trace back to different ancestors who lived at different times, in different places, belonging to different populations. Some of your genes may have originated in a small band sheltering in a green pocket of Africa during a dry phase. Others might trace back to Neanderthals stalking mammoths in Ice Age Europe. Others could descend from Denisovans navigating island chains in Southeast Asia, or from ghost populations in Central or Western Africa we haven't yet recognized in bone. When geneticists look at this full picture, one pattern stands out clearly. Africa contains more genetic diversity than the rest of the world combined. This doesn't just mean more variation. It means that many African populations carry lineages that are older, deeper, and more divergent than those outside Africa. When you compare the genomes of two people from distant African groups, say, one from West Africa and one from Southern Africa, you often find they're more genetically different from each other than either is from someone in Europe or East Asia. This is what you expect if Africa has been home to large, subdivided, interacting human populations for a very long time. Different groups, partially isolated by distance, climate, rivers, forests, deserts, but still occasionally exchanging migrants and genes. A continent full of overlapping experiments in survival, all running at once, sometimes merging, sometimes splitting, sometimes disappearing. When a small subset of these African populations left the continent roughly 60,000 years ago, they carried with them only a fraction of that deep diversity. It's like taking a few branches from an enormous tree and planting them elsewhere. Those branches will grow, change, and diverge, but much of the original complexity stays rooted where it began. So, what does all of this leave us with? Ancient DNA, modern genetics, Neanderthal and Denisovan legacies, ghost populations in Africa, mitochondrial Eve, Y chromosome Adam, and the vast diversity still present across the African continent. They all point in the same direction. The old picture of human evolution as a simple branching tree, with one clean trunk rising in Africa, splitting into neat species that never meet again, doesn't work anymore. The emerging picture looks more like a braided stream. Imagine a wide river flowing through a shifting landscape. Sometimes the water splits into multiple channels, running far apart for a while. One branch might wander into rocky ground. Another might wind through a fertile floodplain. A third might shrink and disappear. Then, downstream, two branches might rejoin, mixing their waters again. Sediments from one branch get carried into another. Colours blend. Patterns shift. That's what our ancestry looks like. Multiple human populations, inside Africa and beyond, splitting, drifting apart genetically, adapting to local conditions, then occasionally coming back together, exchanging genes, technologies, and ideas. Neanderthals, Denisovans, ghost lineages, early Homo sapiens, all part of a single braided flow of humanity over hundreds of thousands of years. There was never just one cradle, one moment, one place where humans appeared fully formed and then marched outward, untouched and unchanged. Instead, there were many cradles, many crossings, many returns. And the proof of that is not just in the ground, not just in the tools and fossils we dig up. It's in you. Every cell in your body is a quiet archive of this braided history. Every gene you carry survived countless bottlenecks, migrations, and encounters. When you think of out of Africa now, you can picture not a single arrow on a map, but a shimmering network of rivers separating and rejoining, carrying the sediments of our past into the present moment. But this braided river wasn't just genetic. It was cultural, technological, social. And as we follow it forward toward the present, another question emerges. If our origins are so entangled, so messy, so shared, what does that mean for how we define us and them? To answer that, we have to step back from DNA and fossils and look at the new synthesis that's coming together. A vision of humanity that's bigger, stranger, and more interconnected than anything science has ever offered before. So where does all of this leave us? For more than a century, scientists tried to tell our origin story as a straight line. First there was some primitive ape thing, then a slightly smarter ape thing, then finally us. Or in the more modern version, there was Africa, our single birthplace, our Garden of Eden. We evolved there, became modern, and then marched out in a grand wave that replaced everything else. It was a tidy story, comforting, simple enough to fit on a textbook diagram or a documentary graphic. But reality, as the fossils and the genes and the stone tools keep whispering to us, is messier, stranger, and in many ways far more beautiful. We're not looking at a single trunk with neat branches anymore. We're looking at a thicket, a tangled forest of lineages, diverging, reconnecting, overlapping in space and time. Evolution, in our case, wasn't a clean split followed by total separation. It was reticulate evolution, a net, not a ladder. Imagine Africa and Eurasia over the last 1,000,000 years as a slowly breathing organism. Populations bud off, drift apart, adapt to local conditions. And then, when climates shift and ranges expand, they meet again. They exchange genes, they swap ideas, tools, and maybe even myths about ancient disasters and wandering ancestors. Then they separate again, change just enough that the next reunion will be different too. The old Out of Africa story was about movement in one direction. Out, a single origin, a single expansion, a single decisive moment when we appeared and everyone else faded away. The new picture is more like waves lapping back and forth on a shoreline. Early humans leaving Africa and then retreating long before 60,000 years ago. Others leaving later and staying. Neanderthals evolving in Eurasia and then sending some of their genes back into us. Denisovans spreading through Asia. Interbreeding with our ancestors in multiple pulses. A long, slow dance of separation and reunion. This is the new synthesis, not a total rejection of Out of Africa, but a reframing, a recognition that our story includes multiple outs, multiple returns, and long periods where there is no clean boundary between us and them. Which brings us to an uncomfortable question. Were Neanderthals, Denisovans, and early Homo sapiens really separate species at all? In textbooks, you've probably seen them written like this: Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis. Denisovans sometimes get the label Homo denisova, or just archaic humans. Separate names, separate categories, separate boxes. But biology doesn't always respect the boxes we draw. One of the classic definitions of a species is simple. If two populations can interbreed and have fertile offspring, they're usually considered the same species. By that standard, horses and donkeys are different species because their offspring, mules, are typically sterile. Chimpanzees and humans are different species because, as far as we know, we can't produce hybrid children. Yet Neanderthals and modern humans not only interbred, they did so repeatedly over tens of thousands of years. The same with Denisovans. Their DNA is not a faint trace from one accidental encounter. It's a tapestry of multiple events in different times and places. Enough mixing that their genes affect how some of us respond to high altitude, to certain viruses, even to how our immune systems behave. So what do we call them? Perhaps they were subspecies, regional variants of a broader human lineage that had only partly diverged. Maybe they were species in a loose sense, distinct enough anatomically and genetically that we can tell their bones apart, but still part of a shared reproductive pool when circumstances allowed. The The truth is, the species concept itself begins to fray at the edges when we apply it to our own past. Nature didn't label these populations for us. It simply let them adapt, meet and mingle when conditions brought them together. From their point of view, there was no neat taxonomy. There were just other people, strange-looking perhaps, speaking differently, thinking differently, carrying different traditions, but still recognizably human. And if that's true, then our definition of human has to stretch. It has to include big-browed Neanderthals burying their dead with care, Denisovans passing on genes that help modern Tibetans breathe on the roof of the world, early Homo sapiens in Africa carving patterns into ochre, wearing beads made from shells, and leaving handprints on cave walls. For a long time, scientists spoke about behavioral modernity as if it were a switch. One moment our ancestors were essentially clever apes. Then, around 50,000 years ago, the story went. A creative explosion happened. Art, symbolism, long-distance trade, complex tools, all supposedly appearing almost overnight, mostly in Europe, mostly with fully modern Homo sapiens. That story is fading. The more archaeologists dig, especially in Africa, the more they find that the light of symbolic behavior doesn't switch on suddenly. It flickers. It glows in different places at different times. It smoulders, goes dim, then flares up again. In southern Africa, at a site called Blombos Cave, people were engraving abstract patterns on pieces of red ochre more than 70,000 years ago. Nearby, at other sites, they were making shell beads, mixing pigments, and maybe even organizing living spaces according to social rules we can only guess at. Far to the north, Neanderthals were collecting rare minerals and bird feathers that seem to have had no practical purpose, only symbolic or decorative ones. In Iberia, there are caves with painted motifs that may predate the arrival of modern humans, suggesting that Neanderthals too were mark makers on stone. Symbolic behavior, then, wasn't the private property of a single species or a single moment. It seeped into different populations at different tempos, shaped by local conditions, group histories, and the slow accumulation of cultural tradition. Instead of a big bang of human consciousness, we see a long dawn, a gradual brightening across continents and millennia. And through all of this, climate was the silent conductor. The ice sheets advanced and retreated. Rain belts shifted north and south, turning forests into deserts and deserts into grasslands. Sea levels rose and fell, opening and closing migration routes. A valley that was a rich refuge in one generation could be a desolate wasteland in the next. Every time the environment changed, populations moved. Some were squeezed into refuges, where small groups were forced to innovate or die. Others followed animals into new regions, encountering unfamiliar landscapes and unfamiliar people. Climate didn't just shape where we lived. It shaped how often those separate branches of humanity bumped into each other. In wet periods, forests expanded, blocking some routes but opening others. In dry cold pulses, open grasslands might link areas that had once been isolated, bringing Neanderthals, Denisovans and Homo sapiens into contact. Each encounter was an opportunity for conflict, for cooperation, for trade, for romance, for language learning and technology borrowing and sometimes gene flow. You can think of climate change as the hand that kept stirring the human pot, keeping the ingredients from settling into neat separate layers, and something else emerges from this new picture. Culture often moved faster than genes. Consider stone tools. In some regions, archaeologists find similar tool types spread over vast distances, even where the genetics suggest limited interbreeding. That means ideas were travelling, even when people weren't mixing much biologically. A flint knapping technique perfected in one valley could be copied and modified hundreds of miles away within a few generations, carried by trade, marriage alliances, visiting hunters or captured rivals. A pigment recipe, a way of hafting a spear, a method for sewing clothing or building a shelter. These could leap from one population to another like sparks on a windy night. Cultural evolution, in this sense, became the real accelerator. Genes changed slowly, constrained by reproduction and the long arc of natural selection. But ideas could move from mind to mind almost instantly. Compared to evolutionary time, they could accumulate, recombine, and sometimes outlive the very populations that first created them. This is why the archaeological record can show sudden appearances of certain technologies far from their original hearths. It's not always that a new people swept in and replaced the locals. Often it's that a new way of thinking arrived. In this mosaic, Southern Africa takes on a special importance. For years, East Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania held the spotlight. The Rift Valley, with its famous fossils, became the default setting for human origins in the public imagination. Lucy lived there. Early Homo erectus walked there, so it was tempting to see it as the singular cradle. But Southern Africa has been quietly rewriting that script. Caves like Blombos, Sibudu, and Clayse's river mouth hold layers upon layers of early Homo sapiens activity. Here we see some of the earliest evidence for complex adhesives, for heat-treated stone, for carefully planned hunting strategies. We see people using fire not just to stay warm, but to pre-process stone to make better tools. We see structured hearths, sleeping areas, and specialized activity zones that hint at social organization and planning. We also see those early stabs at symbolism, engraved ochres, personal ornaments, perhaps the beginnings of shared visual traditions. All of this, tens of thousands of years before similar behaviors are documented in Europe. Does that mean humanity really began in Southern Africa rather than East Africa? Not exactly. It means that the cradle wasn't a single place at all. East Africa, North Africa, Southern Africa, multiple regions were hosting populations that looked and behaved recognizably human, often at overlapping times. Each region contributed threads to the final tapestry. Southern Africa, with its rich and continuous archaeological record, simply gives us one of the clearest windows into that process, a reminder that our species was not born in a single valley, but in a continent-wide experiment in being human. And yet, for all we've learned, the unknowns still loom larger than the facts. We don't know exactly how many distinct human lineages were wandering the Earth 200,000, 400,000, or 800,000 years ago. Every few years, a new fossil or a strange genetic signal suggests the existence of a ghost population, a group that contributed to our DNA but left no clear trace in the bones we've found so far. We don't know precisely when language, real, full, complex language, blossomed. We can infer, we can estimate, but we cannot yet point to a specific ancestor and say, this is the first person who told a story. We don't know how many times populations almost vanished, as they did during that brutal bottleneck around 900,000 years ago. The genetic record shows echoes of crises, but not all of them, and not in high resolution. There may have been other narrow escapes, other episodes when our lineage teetered on the edge, and we don't know exactly why our particular branch survived while others, like the Neanderthals and Denisovans, eventually disappeared as distinct groups. Was it numbers? Social networks? Tiny advantages in communication, cooperation, or child-rearing? Sheer chance? All of this demands a certain humility. When we reconstruct deep history, we're working with fragments. Bits of bone here, a scrap of DNA there, a scattering of stone tools on an ancient riverbank. The gaps between them are vast, and the temptation to fill those gaps with neat stories is strong. The new synthesis warns us to be careful. to treat our diagrams and timelines as hypotheses, not finished truths, to expect the picture to change again and again as new data emerges from caves, deserts, and ancient genomes. But this shifting, complex, tangled story doesn't diminish us. If anything, it makes our origin more remarkable. We are not the inevitable pinnacle of a straight line. We are the contingent outcome of countless crossings and recrossings, the heirs of Neanderthal hunters, Denisovan highlanders, African innovators, and uncounted other cousins whose names we will never know, but whose genes and ideas live on in us. We are the species that emerged from a long precarious balancing act between extinction and survival, chaos and cooperation. A species shaped by droughts and ice, by narrow refuges and wide migrations, by old alliances and new encounters. To rethink what it means to be human, in light of this new synthesis, is to accept that we have always been plural, that our identity was forged not in isolation, but in contact, in shared hardships and exchanged knowledge, in the quiet merging of lineages that had once been apart. And as you lie here, listening, drifting towards sleep, you're carrying all of that inside you. The fused chromosome from a distant bottleneck, the Neanderthal genes that fine-tune aspects of your biology, the Denisovan echoes in your immune system or your response to altitude, if your ancestry links you to those ancient encounters. The symbolic traditions first sketched in ochre on cave walls and in beads worn around long-forgotten necks. The new story of human origins is not a straight path out of one place. It is a web, a network, a slow, shimmering braid of genes and cultures, climates and choices, and it is still being woven. Now zoom forward from that small group leaving Africa 60,000 years ago, all the way to us, to laboratories humming late at night, to archaeologists brushing dust from a fragment of bone, to computers quietly grinding through billions of genetic letters. Our story didn't end when those first humans stepped into Arabia. In some ways, it's only just beginning. Because for the first time in the entire history of our species, the tool we're evolving fastest isn't our bodies, it's our science. Right now, human origins research is in the middle of its own bottleneck and expansion. For most of the 20th century, evidence trickled in slowly. A skull here, a jaw there, a few stone tools. Interpretations were funneled through a narrow set of methods and a few dominant theories. Out of Africa, Garden of Eden, one clean exit, one neat story. But in the last few decades, the constraint has snapped. Like that river bursting out of a narrow channel, new technologies are sending evidence in every direction at once. Old questions are being rewritten. New questions are appearing faster than anyone can answer them, and the future of human origins research is going to be stranger, richer, and more surprising than anything we've imagined so far. Let's start with the tools that are about to change everything. For most of the time we've been studying human evolution, we relied on bones and stones, hard things that fossilize, skulls, teeth, femurs, hand axes, scrapers, blades. If it didn't turn to rock, it was invisible. That meant our view of the past was like watching a movie through a keyhole. But a new wave of techniques is slowly widening that keyhole. One of the most powerful is something called proteomics. DNA breaks down over time. In warm climates, it often disappears entirely after a few tens of thousands of years. But proteins can last much, much longer. They're tougher, more durable. They cling to ancient bones and teeth, like faint fingerprints of long-dead bodies. Proteomics is the science of reading those fingerprints. By sequencing the proteins preserved in old fossils, researchers can reconstruct parts of the original genome, even when DNA is gone. That means we might soon be able to place mysterious fossils more accurately on the human family tree. Was that strange jawbone from China really a Denisovan? Was that fragment from North Africa a cousin of modern humans, or a distant branch entirely? Proteins might be the way we finally find out. Alongside proteomics, dating methods are undergoing their own quiet revolution. For decades, radiocarbon dating was the king of the hill, but it only works reliably back about 50,000 years. The deeper past, the time of early Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans and their ancestors, had to be dated using cruder tools. Layers of volcanic ash, changes in Earth's magnetic field, associations with animal fossils. Now, improved uranium series dating, argon-argon methods and techniques that measure trapped electrons in tiny mineral grains are giving us much sharper timelines. Scientists can date individual teeth, single grains of quartz, even cave formations that grew slowly over hundreds of thousands of years. The blurry outlines of the past are coming into focus. Sometimes that means pushing fossils much older than we thought. Sometimes it means discovering that two species we believed lived side by side were actually separated by tens of thousands of years. And then there's environmental DNA. This might be the strangest of all. When you walk through a forest, sit in a cave, drink from a river, you leave tiny traces of yourself behind. Skin cells, hair fragments, microscopic bits of bodily fluids. Over time, most of this breaks down. But under the right conditions, in cave sediments, lake mud, frozen soils, fragments of DNA can linger. Not from a skeleton, not from a fossil, just from the presence of living bodies that were once there. Environmental DNA, or eDNA, is the art of reading those silent traces. Researchers can scoop up a handful of sediment from the floor of a cave, dissolve it, filter it, sequence it, and sometimes find genetic echoes of humans and animals that never left a single bone behind. Already, this technique has revealed Denisovan DNA in caves where no Denisovan fossils have been found. In the future, we may be able to map where different human groups lived, how they overlapped, and when they disappeared, all from dirt and dust. Put these technologies together and you get something extraordinary. A future where the past is no longer limited to what survives as rock-hard bone, in just the right conditions. A future where every cave, every riverbed, every dusty sediment core might be hiding faint genetic whispers of forgotten people. But here's the strange thing. Even though our methods are getting more sophisticated, large parts of the map are still blank. So far, most of what we know about early humans comes from a few well-studied regions: South and East Africa, parts of Europe, bits of Western Asia, a handful of sites in Siberia and China. But look at a globe in your mind. Think of Central Africa, the vast rainforests of the Congo Basin, the savannas and highlands stretching across the middle of the continent. For most of human history, those places were not empty, yet they're almost absent from the fossil record. Dense forests, acidic soils, relentless humidity. None of that is kind to bone. The same is true for large parts of Arabia. For decades it was imagined mostly as desert, a barrier between Africa and the rest of Eurasia. But new research suggests that during some wet periods, Arabia was dotted with lakes, grasslands and rivers. A green gateway, a place where human populations could have passed through, settled, flourished, and vanished again, leaving very little behind. Then there's Southeast Asia, a maze of islands and drowned continental shelves. During ice ages, sea levels dropped and land connections appeared, creating huge expanses of habitable territory that are now underwater. Those lost landscapes could hold crucial clues: early Homo sapiens, Denisovans, and perhaps entirely unknown human species that shared this tropical world. These regions, Central Africa, Arabia, Southeast Asia, are likely to be the frontiers of human origins research in the coming decades. If proteomics, improved dating, and environmental DNA are the new tools, these are the new treasure maps. But there's a problem. The climate that once shaped our ancestors is changing again, faster than at almost any point in our species' history. Rising temperatures are melting permafrost, thawing glaciers, drying lakes, and rearranging coastlines. On one hand, this might expose new sites, caves emerging from retreating ice, riverbanks eroding to reveal buried bones. On the other hand, it's also destroying evidence. As permafrost melts, organic materials break down faster. Coastal archaeological sites, some of them the only remaining traces of early seafaring peoples, are being swallowed by rising seas and violent storms. Caves, once stable for tens of thousands of years, are seeing shifts in temperature and humidity that can damage paintings, bones, and sediments. Human origins research is in a race against time. We are trying to read our deepest history, just as the pages are starting to crumble. Future archaeologists will have to work not just as excavators, but as emergency responders, triaging which sites can be saved, documenting fragile evidence before it disappears forever. The way we do that work is changing too. For most of its history, paleoanthropology was dominated by a few institutions, a few countries, and often a few loud voices. Data moved slowly. Fossils were locked away, seen by only a handful of experts. Field notes and photographs sat in drawers, unpublished for decades. That world is fading. Now, high-resolution scans of fossils can be shared globally. Genetic data on ancient humans is uploaded to public databases, where hundreds of teams can analyze it from different angles. Young researchers from countries that hold key fossils are leading their own excavations and interpretations, rather than shipping their heritage abroad. Collaboration and data sharing are reshaping the field. A researcher in South Africa can work with a lab in Japan for proteomic analysis, a team in Germany for dating, and a group in the United States for genetic modeling, all on the same specimen. Disagreements still happen, interpretations still clash. But the conversation is wider, louder, and more democratic than ever before, and that brings us to the heart of the matter. Because as the science changes, so do the stories we tell about ourselves. The old out-of-Africa model was simple, comforting in a way. One origin, one exodus, one chosen lineage. You could imagine a single moment when we appeared, fully formed, and everything before that was them. The emerging picture is more complicated. Multiple populations within Africa, interacting, separating, and reconnecting over hundreds of thousands of years. Early excursions out of Africa long before 60,000 years ago. Episodes of interbreeding with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps other, still unnamed relatives. A web, not a straight line. What does that mean for human identity? It means there is no single birthplace where you could stand and say, here. Here is where humans began. No single skull that contains the spark of us. Instead, humanity looks more like a braided river. Channels separating, rejoining, merging, splitting again. No one channel is the real one. All of them together make the river. For some people, that complexity can feel unsettling. It blurs the boundaries between us and them, between modern humans and our extinct cousins. If Neanderthals buried their dead and cared for their injured, if Denisovans passed us genes that helped Tibetans breathe at high altitudes, if multiple African populations contributed to the ancestry of every person alive today, then the line between human and almost human becomes harder to draw. But that blurring may be the most beautiful part. It means that being human isn't about a single place, a single moment, or a single pure lineage. It's about connection, mixture, survival through sharing, not isolation. Of course, not everyone agrees on exactly how this worked. Right now, some researchers support a model sometimes called African multi-regionalism, where different populations within Africa contributed to the modern human gene pool over long periods, without a single origin point. Others still argue for a more classic scenario, a core population, or perhaps a few key refuges, from which the main wave of modern humans arose, with only limited contributions from other groups. There are debates over timing. When exactly did modern traits appear? Over classification. Which fossils count as early Homo sapiens and which are something else? Over interbreeding. How much Neanderthal or Denisovan ancestry do we really carry, and what did it do? These disagreements aren't signs of a field in crisis. They're signs of a field alive. Every new fossil, every new genome, every new dating result nudges the arguments one way or another. In 10 years, some of today's confident models will probably look naive. In 20, we may be telling a version of our story that nobody has quite imagined yet. Through all of this, one thing remains steady. Africa is still the center of gravity. Not the simple single cradle once imagined, but the vast dynamic engine of our evolution. However tangled the branches of our family tree become, they still root in African soil. The earliest known Homo sapiens fossils, the greatest depth of genetic diversity, the long, complex dance of populations that eventually gave rise to every person alive. To say that our story is out of Africa is still broadly true. We just now understand that out of doesn't mean leaving a walled garden. It means emerging from a continent-sized laboratory of evolution, where climate, geography, and time shaped dozens of populations into something that could spread across the world and still remain one species. And this, perhaps, is the most astonishing thing to carry with you as you drift towards sleep. You are the endpoint, for now, of an experiment that has been running for more than 1 million years. Your DNA holds traces of deserts long vanished, forests long turned to dust, and people whose names we will never know. Neanderthal hunters in Ice Age valleys, Denisovan families on misty mountain plateaus, small bands of African survivors huddled at waterholes during endless droughts, generations upon generations who loved, grieved, hoped, and told stories by firelight, all of them pouring slowly, invisibly into you. The future of human origins research will uncover more of them. More faces, more voices, more unexpected twists in a story that refuses to stay simple. We will find new species. We will redraw timelines. We will argue, revise, and argue again. But beneath all the complexity lies a quiet, humbling truth. There has never been a pure, isolated us. From the very beginning, our survival has depended on mixing, sharing, and connecting. Our origins are tangled because our lives have always been entangled. With each other, with other humans, with the changing Earth itself. As new technologies open windows into deeper time and distant places, as forgotten ancestors step slowly out of the dark and into the circle of our awareness, one thing becomes clearer. To be human is to belong to a story that is far older, far wider, and far stranger than any of us were taught. A story written in bones and stones, in ancient proteins and environmental DNA, and in the quiet, beating hearts of billions of living descendants, including yours. So, here we are, at the edge of the map. We started with a simple story, one birthplace, one clean migration, a neat arrow on a textbook diagram, and somewhere along the way, that tidy picture dissolved into something far stranger and far more beautiful. Instead of a single cradle, we found a continent full of them. Instead of one path out of Africa, we found many paths, some looping back, some vanishing, some leaving only a faint whisper in our DNA. Instead of a straight line from primitive to modern, we found branching rivers, side channels, cul-de-sacs, and unexpected crossings in the dark. If that feels messy, that's because real history is messy. But it's also why science is powerful. Science is the one storytelling system humans ever invented that is willing to rewrite its own script. The out of Africa model wasn't a lie. It was the best map we had with the fossils and tools and genetic data available at the time. As new evidence appeared, skulls in unexpected places, stone tools older than they were supposed to be, DNA carrying the signatures of forgotten cousins, scientists didn't double down on the old story. They revised it. They argued, remeasured, redated, and sometimes admitted quietly that a cherished idea had to bend or break. That is the quiet humility of science. Not that it never makes mistakes, but that it keeps trying to correct them. And yet, through all the revisions, some things have not changed. Africa still sits at the heart of the human story, not as a tiny Garden of Eden where everything began in a single spark, but as a vast shifting stage where wave after wave of human and pre-human populations rose, mingled, vanished, and re-emerged. The deepest roots of our species are African. The oldest branches of our family tree are African. The genetic signatures that define modern humans were refined again and again on African ground. No matter how many early excursions may have left Africa and returned, no matter how many mysterious cousins we discover in distant caves, the centre of gravity remains the same. Our primary homeland is that enormous varied continent where savannas, forests, deserts and coastlines shaped minds like ours. And here's the part that matters most, lying there in the dark, listening. For all the complexity, the Neanderthals and Denisovans, the ancient bottlenecks, the forgotten migrations, every person alive today is part of a single continuous fabric. The details of your ancestry may be different from the person next to you. You may carry Neanderthal variants that help your immune system, or Denisovan genes that once helped someone survive at high altitudes. Your family stories may trace through cities, islands, mountains, or deserts. But beneath all of that, you share the same deep history. You carry the chromosome fusion that united those ancient survivors. You carry the echoes of that tiny population that refused to disappear during 117,000 years of crisis. You carry threads from Africa, from expanding frontiers, from quiet valleys where someone long ago cared enough to teach a child how to shape a stone, or tend a fire, or tell a story. Every language you hear, every face you see, is a variation on that same improbable success. If you'd like to leave a small mark on this story tonight, you can. If this journey kept you company as you drifted towards sleep, tap the like button. It helps other curious night owls find their way here. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from, what corner of this planet the descendants of those ancient travellers have carried you to. If you want to stay with us as we explore more strange turns in the human past, you can subscribe, so the next story is waiting for you whenever you need it. And if you feel like going one step further, you can join our channel membership here on YouTube. It's completely optional, but it's one way to support this kind of long, careful storytelling, so we can keep digging through the evidence and keep turning it into gentle histories you can fall asleep to. There are many more journeys ahead. Lost civilizations, vanished species, forgotten technologies, and ideas that changed the world in ways no one at the time could have understood. Whenever you're ready, you can come back, press play, and we'll pick up another thread together. For now, just remember this. You're not separate from this story. You're its latest chapter. Inside your cells, in the quiet spirals of your DNA, is a record of deserts crossed, oceans sailed, winters survived, and friendships forged across ancient campfires. You are the outcome of experiments in cooperation and intelligence that began almost 1,000,000 years ago. As you close your eyes, you're carrying all of that with you, the whole tangled, intertwined history of our species, still unfolding, still unfinished, still being written, and, for a little while longer, still wide awake in you.